Hi, I'm delighted to welcome you to this pre-recorded session for preventing and tackling modern slavery in construction. You will also have been sent a link to our concrete video as additional preparation to help increase your understanding of what modern slavery looks like in the construction sector in the UK today, and I'll refer to that video during this recording. If you haven't already watched it, then please log out, go watch the 12-minute video and come and log in again. You will have the chance to submit any questions you have based on this pre-recording when you attend either of the live sessions aimed at operational staff or those responsible for organisational strategy, planning or implementation. There's also a short quiz at the end of this session to check that you've absorbed the key learning points. But don't worry, we don't share the scores with anyone. So a little bit about Stronger Together first of all. Stronger Together is a not-for-profit organisation working to reduce forced labour, human trafficking and other hidden third-party labour exploitation. My name is Pamela Zielinski and I'm the Construction Sector Programme Manager for Stronger Together. I work alongside our development partner, the Chartered Institute of Building, and our current sponsors, who are Multiplex, Unibail Rodamco Westfield, Wilmot Dixon, the Carey Group, and Saint-Gobain. The outcomes for today's pre-recorded sessions are for you to understand what is modern slavery, what's the issue, how has the UK government responded, and what about modern slavery in the UK construction sector. So let's start with, what is modern slavery? To begin with, it's useful to think about one element of modern slavery, and that is human trafficking. And for the purpose of this session, we're going to be thinking about modern slavery in a business context. So let's think about human trafficking. For most of you, you'll have a pretty good understanding of what human trafficking might look like. And you certainly will if you've seen any of Liam Neeson's films, Taken, Taken 1, Taken 2, Taken on Ice. But human trafficking isn't quite as simple. For example, human trafficking consists of three elements. The first element consists of an action. The second element is the means by which this happens. And then the third element is the fact that it's for a particular purpose. So for the purpose of exploitation. So the first act could be recruitment, transportation, transfer, harbouring, or receipt of persons. And the second element, means, could be the threat or use of force or other forms of coercion, of abduction, fraud, deception, of the abuse of power, or the abuse of a position of vulnerability, or of the giving or receiving of payments or benefits, all for the purpose of exploitation. It might be useful to think just for a moment about the video, the concrete video, and how Yanni and Isaac found themselves in the situation that they were in. So, what was the action, first of all? The action was recruitment. They had been recruited. They had answered an advert in a newspaper. What were the means by which they were being trafficked? The means were that they were being threatened. There was use of force. There was forms of coercion. They hadn't necessarily been abducted, but they were certainly being defrauded. They had been told that they were being offered a job with living accommodation, and it wasn't quite as it had been set out. In other words, that they were being deceived. Their families were being threatened. They were being defrauded because they weren't receiving the correct pay for the work that they were doing. So it's important to realise that human trafficking needs those three elements, and that does help you to start understanding how victims can find themselves to be in the situation that they are in. The next element to consider in a business context is that of forced labour. Forced labour, according to the International Labour Organization, is defined as all work or service that is exacted or taken from any person under the menace of any penalty, and for which the said person has not offered himself or herself voluntarily. I just want you to think for a moment on those words that I've emphasised in bold, under the menace of any penalty. It's very easy to skim over that phrase, but when you think back to the video and consider the penalties that were being threatened to Yanni and Isaac, you start to get some understanding and some insight into the control that the exploiters were exerting over their victims. So, according to the ILO, the International Labour Organization, there's a strong possibility of forced labour if two or more of the following indicators are present. You might ask yourself, why do we need two or more of the following? Why not just any one? So let's just give it some thought. The first one is threats of or actual physical or sexual violence. Now, there may be occasions where you're unfortunate enough to witness something like that, and if you did, think about what would you define it as? What heading would you put it under? How would you report it? And for most organisations, you would consider reporting it as bullying and harassment. Or if it was serious enough, you might actually decide to report it to the police as an assault. So you can see where that can exist in and of itself and not be part of forced labour. Similarly, you could see removal of phones, restriction of movement, and confinement to the workplace or to a limited area. And that could be just due to normal operational circumstances. So, for example, on a building site, there might be areas where certain workers are restricted from entering. If you were working on a secure site, like an MOD site, a Ministry of Defence site, then there certainly would be areas that you wouldn't be able to access. You might have to have your phones removed if you were working, say for example, in a hospital or a school for safeguarding purposes. So you can see again where that may exist in and of itself. Debt bondage, for example. I came across a really good example of debt bondage where it was in existence but not part of a broader forced labour issue. When I met a waitress, I was visiting the Lake District with some friends, and we were having dinner in a restaurant, and our waitress had an Eastern European name on her name tag and Eastern European accent. So I asked her how she came to be in the Lake District, and she described the situation. She told her story where she had applied for a job in France. She was originally from Bulgaria. She travelled to a hotel in France and was working in a hotel. After 5 weeks, she hadn't received any payment. The owners of the hotel told her that they were owed money for certain paperwork, that she owed them money for accommodation and food, and every week there was a different reason as to why she wasn't being paid. So after 5 or 6 weeks, she decided basically to draw a line and realised that the situation wasn't going to improve. And so she decided to just exit from that situation. And she was able to do that because there was no threats of or actual physical or sexual violence. They hadn't retained her passport. They weren't threatening to denounce her to the authorities. So whilst she may have been a victim of debt bondage, she wasn't necessarily a victim of forced labour, and you can see the difference. And the importance of this is to understand that what we're asking you to do is to have a radar with the title of modern slavery, and to be conscious of the different alerts, the different indicators that might suggest that forced labour is in existence, and so the blips on the radar would start to flash and you'd see them flashing more frequently or getting larger. So we're asking you to be conscious of these types of indicators to suggest when there might be incidents of forced labour. So human trafficking and forced labour come under the umbrella term of modern slavery. Modern slavery was a term that was developed by the UK government, essentially to pull together pre-existing legislation, pre-existing offences, all under the one title of modern slavery. And there's lots of different nuances to the different examples of offences under modern slavery. But essentially, they all involve one person depriving another person of their liberty in order to exploit them for personal or commercial gain. So this isn't just about perhaps not paying somebody the minimum wage or not paying their holiday pay or forcing them to work in abnormal or bad working conditions. This is about people being deprived of their liberty. So what is the issue with regards to modern slavery? So let's consider the global issue first of all. This map is produced by the Global Slavery Index, and this shows the results from the 2018 index. The darker the colour, the higher the prevalence of slavery estimated within any one country. And you can see that also in the map they have pulled out the top 10 countries which have the highest proportion of their population estimated to be enslaved. You will note that the top country is North Korea with approximately 104.6 per 1,000 of their population estimated to be enslaved. And it covers other countries all the way across the globe. According to the ILO, the International Labour Organization, there are around about 40 million victims of all forms of slavery across the world, 25 million of whom are in forced labour, and 16 million of those are in the private sector. 4 million victims are victims of state-imposed slavery, thought to be in North Korea and in places like Uzbekistan, associated with the cotton industry. But what's happening across the world today? What's happening geopolitically? Well, what we do see is that there is a population movement going from here across to here. Why might that be happening? Well, there's a number of reasons. The first reason could be simply for economic reasons. So people seeking better opportunities for themselves and their families, and we call them economic migrants. But there are other reasons, such as fleeing conflict, particularly in the Middle East. We've seen lots of examples of people fleeing across the Mediterranean in dinghies and arriving in Europe and then moving through Europe. So what we are seeing is that there's a gradual movement going across the world towards Europe, and increasingly in the past there have been large numbers coming into the UK. And it's interesting just to think for a moment about what is it about the UK that makes us such an attractive country for people to move to. Of course, we have a very good infrastructure, we have good education, we have a good health system, we have skill shortages, so we are looking for workers in agriculture and in construction. We have good regulation, good governance in terms of our working environments, so we have a minimum wage and we have good health and safety. So if I was a gangmaster wanting to ensure that I was increasing the return on any investment that I've made, then the UK is quite a good option for me. Some of the other things to consider would be that the UK is English speaking. English is the most common second language around the world, so victims are more likely to understand at least a little more English than they would perhaps other European languages. So let's have a think now about the government response here in the United Kingdom. So the act that's relevant and why ostensibly we're covering this today is the Modern Slavery Act of 2015. A lot of people are familiar with the requirement of the Act to publish modern slavery statements. However, less people are more concerned about the other details within the Act, and there are some details that I think are worth just considering before we move into talking about the other areas of compliance. So if we consider the Modern Slavery Act, and again it's available online if you wanted to go and have a look at it, just enter Modern Slavery Act 2015 into Google. So the Act says that slavery, servitude and forced or compulsory labour. Number one, a person commits an offence if, and let's go down to B, because this is the section to do with forced or compulsory labour. So a person commits an offence if the person requires another person to perform forced or compulsory labour and the circumstances are such that the person knows or ought to know that the other person is being required to perform forced or compulsory labour. That's quite a legalese type way of writing it. So let's just break that down a little and just try and examine what that paragraph actually means. So if we got to number one, a person commits an offence. So let's say me, Pamela. Pamela commits an offence if, let's go down to B, the person, i.e. Pamela, requires another person. Let's say my friend Fiona. So Pamela requires Fiona to perform forced or compulsory labour, and the circumstances are such that Pamela knows or ought to know that Fiona is being required to perform forced or compulsory labour. What does that mean in plain English? Essentially, it means that ignorance is no defence. So I ought to know, I should do everything possible to find out if the people that I'm requiring to work for me are actually subjected to forced or compulsory labour. And if I don't, and if I ought to know, then I commit an offence. That's really important. And a lot of people are not aware of that because the Act doesn't just talk about compliance with regards to modern slavery statement. There is actually a criminal offence if you require somebody to undertake forced or compulsory labour, and you ought to have known that that was the case, whether or not that's in your business or whether it's in your supply chain. What it means is that even if you don't have to produce a modern slavery statement, it doesn't mean that you can go off and require people to do forced or compulsory labour. So the relevant section is section 54. It's called Transparency in Supply Chains, and that's quite a big clue as to what you have to do to address this issue in your business. Section 54, quite often abbreviated to TISC for Transparency in Supply Chain, says that every commercial organisation which supplies goods or services and has a total annual turnover of not less than 36 million, so 36 million or above, must produce a statement of the steps the organisation has taken to ensure that slavery and human trafficking is not taking place in any of its supply chain and in any part of its business. Or, currently, you can publish a statement to say that the organisation has taken no steps. Frankly, I haven't seen any statements that say that because I think customers and consumers would have a negative reaction to that. But honestly, I've seen a number of statements, particularly related to construction sector, where the statements might well have said they are taking no such steps. The statement must appear on your website in a prominent place that can be reached from the homepage. It must be approved by the board of directors and signed by a director. So not just a typed name, it must be showing the director's signature. And it should be updated annually. And by the way, updated annually doesn't mean copy and paste and change the date. It means that it should show year on year, progressively, what your organisation is doing to tackle modern slavery. And quite often nowadays, companies are leaving previous modern slavery statements on their websites so that customers or consumers can go back and check what is different about this year's modern slavery statement. It can be quite overwhelming to think about having to consider modern slavery in any part of your supply chain or any part of your business. However, the Home Office guidelines, which are contained in this document, Transparency in Supply Chains, etc., a practical guide, again downloadable for free online. The guidelines say that due diligence procedures and efforts should be proportionate to the identified modern slavery risk. What does that mean? It means the amount or severity of the risk, the level of influence a business may have. And it can also be informed by any broader risk assessments that have been conducted. So, if you have conducted, say, for example, health and safety risk assessments, and you have found that an organisation has performed poorly against those audits, that might inform your thinking about whether or not they are likely to then excel in their approach to modern slavery if they aren't excelling in their health and safety. In terms of the level of influence a business may have, that means how much you are spending with a supplier, and importantly, what proportion of their revenue does that equate to? So, are you a significant customer of that supplier? Will you have the opportunity to influence? So, for example, if I was running a delicatessen here in my local town in Scotland, I will have less opportunity to influence a supplier than perhaps one of the major retailers. So, what about the construction sector? There was a report published by our development partners, the Chartered Institute of Building, in May 2018. You can see the report on the right of the page here, and I would definitely recommend it as a good read in terms of the specifics around modern slavery in construction. Kevin Hyland at the time was the Independent Anti-Slavery Commissioner for the UK, and he wrote the foreword of the report, which you can read for yourself. But essentially, Kevin Hyland said that construction is a crucial sector within the UK economy, and in 2016 the value of new construction work reached its highest level on record at over £99 billion, creating over 55,000 new jobs. However, said Kevin Hyland, with this success comes a challenge. Modern day slavery is hidden on construction sites across the UK today. The chief executive at the time of the Chartered Institute of Building was Chris Blythe, and he, in his introduction, took a much more succinct approach and stated, "There's a view from some quarters that modern slavery is not a serious problem in UK construction. We disagree." And that was based on the findings of the report. What do we know so far about construction? Well, we know that in Europe, construction ranks second only to the sex industry as being most at risk of modern slavery. In the UK, anti-slavery leaders highlight construction as a priority area, not just the Independent Anti-Slavery Commissioner, but also the Gangmaster and Labour Abuse Authority highlights construction as one of their top priority sectors. In other words, a sector that they know which is at particularly high risk. Incidents have been found on major infrastructure projects and power plants, PFI hospital projects, and housing and regeneration schemes, demolition and recycling sectors. And on the right, in the lighter coloured boxes, you'll see the activities associated with construction that are considered to be of the highest risk within the sector. This is based on intelligence and data that has been pulled in via the Gangmaster and Labour Abuse Authority. So, why is construction such high risk? What are the risk factors? The report, the CIOB report, pulled out a number of factors which they believed played into the opportunities. They highlighted the high reliance on migrant labour. the fragmented supply chain, escalating use of agency labour, a high proportion of low-skilled workers, temporary projects, so not a static workforce, tight time constraints, very much a price-driven culture, very low margins, a lack of transparency in the supply chain, and procurement of materials with really complex supply chains. And when I deliver this training face to face and I go through this slide, I ask if there's anything in there which people would like to debate, and I haven't really had any debate or challenge around these factors and why they might be creating the very best opportunity for exploitation to occur. On top of the risk factors, there are also risks associated with just the way the construction sector operates, in other words, the system of construction. So the report called out abuse of the retention system, late discounted or non-payment of fees, agency labour again, bogus self-employment and umbrella companies, a worrying increase in bullying, intimidation and new blacklisting, very much associated in terms of risks with lowest cost tendering and a decline of collective bargaining. And that was not even covering the risks associated with the amount of perhaps smaller projects associated with domestic clients. And what enables this exploitation to occur? What is the construction sector doing or not doing that enables this to happen? So there are failures in auditing. So in the same way that you can undertake health and safety and environmental auditing, you can also undertake social auditing. However, social auditing never finds instances of modern slavery. It has its benefits, so it will provide a snapshot in time at any one time. It will give you an insight into perhaps the way in which an organisation is being run, how rigorous and robust its management systems are. It may allow you to relatively rank each of your suppliers with regards to their approach to modern slavery, but it never finds victims, so that in itself can be seen as a failure. There is still, unfortunately, a lot of secrecy and a lot of concern around about reputational damage caused by instances of modern slavery. However, again, in the face-to-face workshops that I run, there are quite often conversations occurring about the volume, the frequency, the instances of modern slavery that individuals and participants have seen or suspected now that they are learning more about modern slavery, maybe even going back 5, 10 years or longer. There's real denial and disbelief that it can happen here. So many organisations will nod sagely when they are talking about modern slavery, but then point to other organisations as being much more likely or susceptible to incidents occurring. I've also found through the participants that come to the workshop that there is generally still quite a poor understanding of the problem, although there is increasing awareness because of media coverage. There's certainly a misunderstanding of the differences between the right to work and anti-slavery checks. So you can check a person's right to work, and that will comply with the right to work requirements, but it doesn't demonstrate whether that person is working voluntarily or whether they are being forced to work for somebody who's exploiting them. Another issue that was pulled out in the CIOB report was that there was a lot of risk being pushed down the supply chain. So at the top of the chain, there are lots of contracts and terms and conditions, and suppliers being asked to sign statements to say that they have done the checks and that they can guarantee there is no modern slavery in their business or their supply chain, and it's only by signing those documents that they are able to receive a contract and to be successful in a tender. And then, as usual, as we all know, there are various circumstances and scenarios that can influence projects, and therefore there are last minute changes and last minute decisions on site which affect the need or the timing or the volume of labour, and therefore putting more demand on that labour supply. And what about the future? Well, we're currently in the coronavirus scenario. Possibly you're watching this once lockdown is complete and we're all back to normal. But what are the future risks and impacts? The CIOB report pulled out a number of considerations. So costs. Costs once Britain formally gets through the transition period and exits Europe, and the trading agreements currently that are in place have come to an end. So what will be the impact of costs of goods or services, and how will that impact overall in terms of margins and profitability? There's also a risk of increasing organised crime. So the new Independent Anti-Slavery Commissioner, Dame Sarah Thornton, in her first report pointed to the need for much more effort and resources to be put into place to fight organised crime, because police forces across the country have seen an increase in organised crime, and therefore, as organised crime is associated with modern slavery in the UK, that could lead to increasing numbers of incidents. Falling migration was an issue that was pulled out at the time. Before the coronavirus, certainly we were seeing that migration from the rest of the world was staying fairly static. However, migration from Eastern Europe, where traditionally our migrant workers have come from for the construction sector, we were seeing a reduction in migration from Eastern Europe. So with Brexit and with everything else that's going on in the world, what will happen in the future with regards to migration opportunities, and what will happen in place of more formalised migration is something that's of issue or concern. And we've also recently seen the start of the UK government's approach to immigration and the points system that may be in place. So again, less potential opportunity for migrant workers to come to the UK, leaving a definite gap in terms of labour supply. And where there's a gap in labour supply, the exploiters are more than willing to come in and fill that gap. Just another couple of issues that the CIOB report pulled out, which are worthy of note, and that is that where there are victims of modern slavery in the construction sector, there can be a correlation to theft. So exploiters will exploit victims by forcing them to work, but also by forcing them to steal from their workplace or their fellow workers. And in addition, there is a correlation or a potential correlation between the incidents of modern slavery and health and safety, or a decline in health and safety standards. Because let's face it, if you are a victim of modern slavery and you're in fear for what may happen to you or your family, I think that might be occupying your mind rather than a working at height or a manual handling methodology. I've come to the end of the pre-recorded session, and I did say that you would have an opportunity to ask questions. So what I suggest is that you scribble down your questions, and when you come to the live session, whether it's the operational session or whether it's the session for those involved in the strategy planning and implementation for organisations, you will have an opportunity to pose your questions during that live session. So please note them down now, and I'll be really happy to try and answer all of your questions when I speak to you live in your next planned session.